So today I thought I would bring you guys along with me as I make a loaf of homemade sourdough bread, but I'm going to show you how I do it like the lazy way, I guess you could say, and it speeds up the process so that it gets done the same day. And so I'm starting this loaf around 10 o'clock in the morning, and we should have bread at least by like 5-6 o'clock, something like that. And you don't need a proofing box or any special tools. I'm going to show you how I do this with no tools because I do not have room for another kitchen appliance in my kitchen, especially a proofing box. Usually they're really big. So I'm going to show you what I came up with. And I have no idea if tons of people have been doing this forever and I'm just now getting on board with it. I have no idea, but this is just how I do it and how I speed up the process. So the very first thing that you're gonna need is a heavy bowl, and I'm just using this like crock bowl. Maybe it's pottery, I don't know, but it's heavy. So you're gonna need a bowl that it's not gonna float. So if I use my enamelware bowls, they always float and I cannot do that. So we're gonna be putting it in a water bath essentially. So it just needs to not float, that way it doesn't like tip over and get your dough wet or anything like that. And then this is completely optional. I'm gonna give you the gram measurement as well as like the cup measurement, because I know a lot of people use a scale, so a kitchen scale is optional, but also just measuring cups and measuring spoons. So right now I have filtered water heating up in my teapot back there, and it is just water from our Berkey. So make sure you're starting with a good water and not just straight from your tap, unless that's what you're used to using. And if you already have a bread recipe, then totally use that and just skip along, but you do need to increase the amount of sourdough starter that you use. So for my normal recipe, if I let it cold proof in the fridge, then I use half the amount that I'm going to use today. So I do double the amount just to speed it up so that it can take over the dough quicker, and that way it is more sourdough, because if not, then it doesn't take over near fast enough and you're not going to get a loaf of bread in the same day, I've found it. And I am not a sourdough expert. I just bend and break a lot of rules to make it work for me, because I do not have time to drag the bread making process out over 2 days. Almost every single time I forget about it being in my fridge, and then it ends up overproofing, and nobody wants to eat hard, dense loaf of bread. And for this process, I do set timers on my phone, or otherwise I will not remember. I am so bad at remembering. I'll get sidetracked and go do something else. So I do set timers on my phone throughout this entire thing. And if this is kind of confusing or this schedule doesn't work for you, I am gonna leave a link to the blog post, and over there I'm going to add timelines that you can go by. So it'll be like schedules based off different times that you can follow in case this timeline doesn't work for you. Okay, so I have my warm water. It is not hot at all, and I am gonna do this on a scale just for those of you that use a scale. But you're gonna start with 1.5 cups of water, or it's either 320 grams of water. So I'm gonna do 320 grams of water. That's why I don't like using a kitchen scale. You have to be so precise about it, and like I feel like it just slows down the process. But 320 grams of water we got in here. So now we are gonna add, this varies, it depends on how like dense your sourdough starter is. So I have tried measuring out 1 cup of sourdough starter, and every single time get something different based on how, and mine definitely overflowed last night, but that's okay. But it is going to be about 200 to 230 grams of starter, but it's equal to 1 cup. So I'm actually going to get a cup and just measure it out. It's easier than trying to weigh it out. So in my normal bread recipe, if I'm cold proofing it, I'll just use half a cup of starter. But today, since I'm doing it this way, I am going to use 1 cup. So there's that is. And I'm actually going to bring you guys up close so you can see everything. So as you can see, it is nice and bubbly. And we're just going to pour that in. So now we're just going to whisk it up. And I'm actually going to be using bread flour today, and you're going to need 500 grams of bread flour. But like I said, use whatever works in your recipe. And if you're not doing it by grams, then that was about 3.5 cups of flour. So you're just going to get it well incorporated, and it should look really shaggy. But you do want to make sure that you get all the flour down in there. One thing I have come to find is that sourdough is truly based on where you live, because I have tried recipes from all over the United States, and like even a recipe in Ohio that I tried, I could not use their recipe because it looked like a runny puddle by the time I was done with it because of our humidity level here. So you may need to add more flour or take away, and that's why I say to use your own recipe. But this is just a base recipe, and you may have to add more flour or take away depending on where you live and your humidity level. So what we're gonna do next is we're gonna fill up one side of our sink. So if you have a like apron sink that is all one basin, then you'll probably need to get a bigger bowl than your bowl that your sourdough is in and let it bath in a bigger bowl of water. But if you have a double basin sink, I just do it right in my Whenever you put your water in here, I started running some, but you need to make sure that it is cooler than bath water but still warm. So on the thermometer, I have a thermometer. Usually I put it right around like 82 degrees and it will cool off, so you'll have to refill eventually. But I only fill it up about probably like halfway on my bowl, just so it doesn't float or tip over or anything like that. Okay, so we're just gonna set our bowl down in there, and I cover mine with a rag. I get it wet, and it just keeps it from drying out. And that way it is warm water on top, and it's just holding in the heat more. So that is how I do that. And we're just gonna let that sit for 30 minutes. So I did wanna show you the time. It is 9:54, hopefully you can see that. And I do have a timer set for 30 minutes. I know I do not follow all the typical sourdough rules and stuff like that, but this is just the quickest way I found to get a loaf of bread without having to spend the money on a proofing box, because essentially what we're doing in the sink is creating a good environment for the sourdough to thrive and grow and take over the bread. So what that takes is humidity, because if you look at proofing boxes, you add water to them and you create humidity and it introduces heat. So that's what we're doing with the warm water, is just doing both of those in one. With the warm water, it is creating humidity and it is giving the warmth. But I'm gonna work on mixing up a chocolate loaf, and I will see you guys in 30 minutes. It has been 30 minutes and I'm gonna take my original sourdough loaf, which is this one, out. I'm also doing a chocolate loaf, so that's why I have two in here. But I'm gonna wipe off the bottom, and then I'm gonna take my bowl over to the island and finish adding the salt and extra water if I need. So here's what the dough is looking like, and at this point you can either weigh it out and do 10 grams of salt, but I just do 2 teaspoons. It's essentially the same. And my dough does look a little bit dry, so I'm gonna add, usually it's about 1/8 of a cup. I ended up doing 23 grams. And I'm just gonna use my hand to start to incorporate this. And I like to just pinch it and, like, I don't know, kind of like wad it into a fist. Okay, so now we're going to cover this back over with our rag and put it back in our water. If your sink needs warm back up, you can drain your sink and add more warm water, but I think mine's probably good because I refreshed it whenever I put the chocolate in there. And I'm gonna let it sit for another 30 minutes. It has been 30 minutes, so we're gonna start our first stretch and folds. And if I do this process on the counter, whenever I do my stretch and folds, the dough is not so puffy already. Like, you can tell that the sourdough is not working at this point by now. And putting it in the water, it is already very, very, like, puffy is not the right word. I don't know how to describe it, but you can tell that the sourdough is working and it is further along in the process than normal. So now we're gonna cover it and put it back in for 30 minutes. And my water is still fine, so I'm gonna leave it and I'll probably change it on the next go round. It has been another 30 minutes, so I'm going to do a stretch and fold on each of these. And this time I am going to change my water, so I'm gonna go ahead and drain it. If your dough is really sticky, you can go ahead and wet your hands to work the dough, but I find that it makes my dough too wet, so I'd rather just get some on my hands. By now you should be able to smell the sourdough smell. I can smell it already and it smells really good. We are back again 30 minutes later, and we're just going to repeat the process with both of these. So this is going to be our fourth and final stretch and fold, and then after this we are going to change the water and just let it sit in the water for 1.5 hours, and then we're going to check it and see if it needs any longer, because as you can see it is already starting to double. Like, I don't know if you can tell, and it's super jiggly. So it is starting to rise, and it's going to do a lot during that 1.5 hour. It has been 1.5 hours, but I want my dough to rise a little bit more than that. So I'm gonna put new water in here, warm water, and let it sit for an additional 30 minutes. So I ended up allowing the dough to sit for an hour instead of the extra 30 minutes. So in total, it sat in here for 3 hours. And as you can tell, it bulk fermented and it did its job. It has doubled in size. And now we are going to put it on the stove and laminate it. I just floured my basket here, and everybody uses these differently. Some people flour the actual inside and put the dough in there and then just use the bowl as a cover, but I really don't know how you're supposed to use it, so I just use it like that. And I'm gonna dust some flour out here. And it really does not take much at all. Like, you really don't want that much flour, just so that your dough can stick to itself. So now I'm just gonna laminate the dough, and I'm just gonna pull it very gently apart, and honestly just kind of make it as big as I can without tearing it. I forgot, we should preheat our oven. So it preheats to 480. Okay, now I just fold the dough over on itself, and you can honestly do this however, and then just roll it up. And then just carefully start shaping. And it does take a second for it to come together. It is so, I don't know what other word to use besides puffy. Like, it's very an airy dough. So it feels like you are going to pop it at any second. If your hands are sticking too much, you can add a little bit of flour, but you don't want to add too much because you really want the dough to stick to itself. And that way it builds good tension. And you'll see air bubbles all along the surface. You don't want to pop those, so just kind of leave them alone and don't try and pop them. Just let them be. But you want to try and build really good tension, because this is what is going to give you your oven spring, and it keeps your dough from spreading in the Dutch oven. So it'll go up and give you your tall loaf that you want instead of just spreading in your Dutch oven. I'm going to get my bench scraper. You can either let it sit on the counter just like this as is. You do need to cover it though. Or you can put it into your freezer if you care about how it looks whenever you score it. So as of right now, if you don't put it in your freezer, then whenever you go to score it, it's not gonna hold a shape very well. And it is gonna be hard to score. So I really don't care about scoring. I just throw it in the Dutch oven. So I'm gonna leave mine sit here for 30 minutes and I'm gonna cover it, and I'll be back in 30 minutes. But during this time, if you care about how your score looks, then pop it in the freezer. And I forgot to mention, don't put your Dutch oven in the oven. So we're going to be cooking in a cold Dutch oven, and that is how we are going to get a really nice oven spring. And also it's going to help from getting such a hard crust. I cannot stand a very hard crust. So if you want a hard crust, then probably preheat your Dutch oven, but I don't like one, so I put mine in a cold. Something I really don't see very many people talk about is using a Dutch oven that is too small. So previously I was using a 5.5 quart Dutch oven, and I don't know exactly how many quarts this one is. It has a number 12 on the top. It's a vintage cast iron Dutch oven. It is a lot bigger, and now I can finally get a good rise out of my loaf. So I'm not going to clean up yet just because I still have my other loaf of bread to do. But I'm going to go ahead and put my sourdough onto my parchment paper. And you don't want to score it yet until you go to put it in the oven. So don't score it yet. So I'm going to take a scoop of ice and put it underneath the edge of the parchment paper. And we have the nugget ice, so I would say that's probably 2 or 3 regular size ice cubes. And I'm going to place my lid on and then put it in the oven. So I just put my bread in the oven, and I wanted to show you guys that it is 3:59, so almost 4 o'clock. And after it bakes, then by 5 o'clock we should have a loaf of bread. Well, a little after 5. So of course I would forget to do it on today of all days whenever I'm filming to show you guys how to do this. But whenever I put it in my Dutch oven, I forgot to score it. So this is how it ended up coming out, and you can see that it tried doing it on its own, but it just didn't have that slit in it to allow for expanding. So I'm curious to see how this loaf looks. I mean, it rose fine, but it just did not. I'm sure it would have rose even more if it had that room for expansion. So when you put it in your Dutch oven, and after you put your ice in, make sure you score it and do not mess up like I just pulled the chocolate sourdough bread out of the oven, and I thought I would show you guys that there's not much height difference, so both of them did rise. But this one I did score, and as you can see, it like exploded. So like my X was right here, and this is the top. So it grew a lot, and then as I told you, I forgot to score that one. So this is what it would look like, but usually it doesn't expand this much. This is the most expansion I've ever got. So normally it would just expand and the scoring would still be up here. But I hope you guys found this video helpful, and hopefully you can make your own sourdough bread in a day now. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys will like and subscribe.